Welcome, my fellow seekers of forgotten truths. Before we descend into the blood-soaked mists of medieval Scandinavia, tell me where in the world you find yourself this evening, and what hour marks your journey into darkness. Whether you're settling beneath warm covers in New York, watching dawn break over Tokyo, or finding yourself somewhere between sleeping and waking, I'm grateful you've chosen to walk this shadowed path with me. If these explorations into humanity's most brutal chapters stir something within you, consider subscribing so you never miss our ventures into the abyss. Now, let your modern comforts fade away as we step into a world where death sailed on wooden wings and mercy was a luxury few could afford. Picture now not the fjords of Norway, but the dense wilderness, vast plains, and towering peaks of a land called the New World. Before ships arrived with steel and scripture, this land was alive, not empty, breathing with the chants of elders and the rhythm of ancient drums. Its heart pulsed through civilizations who had charted the stars, carved cities into cliffs, and honored the earth not as a resource, but as a living ancestor. They were the ancestral Puebloans, the Maya, the Aztecs, the Inca, the Cherokee, the Hopi, and countless others whose names have been reduced to footnotes or erased entirely. Their languages were many, their beliefs older than empire. They lived not in chaos, but in harmony, not as savages, but as stewards of their lands. And yet, when the sails of conquest appeared on the horizon, they were marked not as brothers or neighbors, but as obstacles to be removed. The discovery of the Americas was no discovery at all. It was a reckoning. With the arrival of European powers came plague, fire, and the cross often hand in hand. The newcomers brought diseases these lands had never known, killing millions before a sword was ever drawn. In some villages, entire populations vanished within weeks. Survivors watched their families cough blood and collapse, their prayers drowned in silence. And as the sickness faded, the swords came. Conquerors came draped in velvet and steel, holding scripture in one hand and shackles in the other. Children were taken from mothers, sacred places burned. The drums stopped. In their place came bells not to summon spirits, but to signal submission. And in the aftermath, silence reigned. But the land, even in grief, remembered. The ruins that remain today are not ruins of disorder, but of brilliance interrupted. Stone cities aligned with celestial bodies, irrigation systems that defied geography, languages that carried entire philosophies in a single word. These were not primitive people. They were targeted precisely because they were powerful in ways empire could not tolerate. The question, then, is not how these people vanished. It is why we were taught to forget them. And as we begin this long journey through the ashes, remember this. History is written by the fire, but truth lives in the smoke. Imagine standing in the heart of Tenochtitlan, a city that shimmered like a mirage above the waters of Lake Texcoco. Raised in the middle of a vast lake by the ingenuity of a people who saw stone and water not as limits, but as tools of divine creation. A city where roads floated, temples touched the sky, and every movement, every ritual, was part of a sacred balance between man and God. You are a priest in this city of sun, tasked with preserving the eternal rhythm that keeps the world from crumbling. The Aztecs believed that the universe was delicate, held together by sacrifice and devotion. The sun rose because hearts were offered. The rain fell because blood was spilled. To stop was to allow darkness to consume everything. But no amount of ritual could prepare them for what approached from the sea. In 1519, a man arrived from Spain, Hernán Cortés. He came not as a pilgrim, but as a predator. And though his weapons were few, a few hundred men, some muskets, horses unfamiliar to this land, he wielded something far more potent than gunpowder. Ambition cloaked in divine justification. At first, Moctezuma, the Aztec emperor, welcomed him. Legends spoke of pale gods returning across the sea. Was this man a prophecy made flesh? Gifts were exchanged, peace offered, but it was not peace Cortés had come for. He had come for the city's beating heart, its gold, and its soul. For months, the Spaniards moved like shadows through the empire. They whispered to rival tribes, fed old grudges, promised revenge and victory. They were not just invaders, they were manipulators. And when the moment was right, they struck. Moctezuma was taken hostage, used like a puppet to control the very people he once ruled. When rebellion stirred, blood ran in the streets. The Spaniards responded with massacres inside sacred temples, shattering idols, torching codices, tearing the soul out of the Aztec world page by page, shrine by shrine. But the true siege was yet to come. By 1521, Tenochtitlan stood alone, encircled by allies turned traitors, by steel-armored ghosts who understood one thing better than warfare. The lakes that once nourished the city became graveyards. Bodies floated where flowers once blossomed. Disease roared through the population, devouring thousands in silence. The temples burned. Mothers drowned themselves with their children rather than face enslavement. Priests made their final offerings to a sun that no longer answered. The capital of the Aztec world, once called the Venice of the New World, collapsed under smoke, blood, and stone. Cortés built a church atop the ruins. What had taken generations to raise was erased in weeks. The people who had charted the stars and mapped the heavens were now forced to bow before crosses held by men who spoke in fire and took in blood. And yet, even in defeat, they left behind echoes. Stone carvings buried beneath churches, glyphs hidden in textiles, myths preserved in secret by grandmothers whispering to grandchildren in the language empire failed to destroy. The Aztecs were not extinguished. They were scorched, shattered, and scattered, but their memory still bleeds through the land they once ruled. The conquerors recorded their own version of history, one where they brought salvation to savages. But we know better. They did not bring light. They brought shadows so dense, even the gods seemed to vanish. And in that suffocating dark, an entire civilization screamed, and no one listened. Now imagine a place where the earth brushes the sky, where stone cities cling to cliffs like the bones of giants, and every terrace carved into the mountain is both a prayer and a defiance of gravity. This is the realm of the Inca, the children of the sun, high in the Andes Mountains, where life was hard, but meaning was everywhere. Their roads wound through clouds. Their cities were built without mortar, yet so precisely that not even a blade of grass could slide between stones. Their empire was vast, stretching across deserts, jungles, snow-capped peaks. But unlike the kingdoms of Europe, it was held together not by paper treaties or aristocratic titles, but by intricate systems of labor, community, and reverence for nature. The sun was not just a symbol, it was the breath of life. The Sapa Inca, their emperor, was believed to be its direct descendant. His word was law, not because of tyranny, but because it echoed divine will. Crops were grown in precise harmony with seasons and stars. The people gave their labor to the state, and the state fed them in return. But even this great web of unity could not withstand the storm crawling over the horizon. In 1532, the Spanish arrived again. This time it was Francisco Pizarro, a man with less than 200 men under his command, but centuries of European warfare carved into his bones. He stepped onto Peruvian soil not to trade, not to learn, but to conquer. And fate, as always, seemed to conspire in his favor. The Inca Empire was in turmoil. A brutal civil war between two royal brothers, Huascar and Atahualpa, had just ended, and the wounds were still fresh. Pizarro didn't need to bring an army. The empire was already bleeding from within. Atahualpa, freshly crowned, agreed to meet the strange newcomers. Perhaps he too hoped for diplomacy. Instead, he found a trap. At their meeting, a Spanish priest handed him a Bible, a symbol of European faith and dominance. Atahualpa, never having seen a book, opened it, held it to his ear, confused by its silence, and set it aside. That simple act, misunderstanding, not malice, was declared blasphemy. It was all the justification the Spaniards needed. Cannon fire exploded. Horses charged. Spanish steel cut through unarmored flesh. Thousands of Inca were slaughtered in minutes, and Atahualpa, the son of the sun, was dragged away in chains. He offered a ransom unlike any in history, a room filled with gold, another with silver. The wealth of an empire, all for his life. The Spaniards took it. They melted sacred idols, stripped temples, filled their ships, and then they killed him anyway. Not by fire, as was custom for heretics, no, they offered him a Christian baptism first. And when he accepted, hoping for mercy, they strangled him with a garrote. His final breath, choked not by flames, but by the cold hands of conquest disguised as salvation. The empire fought back. Guerrilla resistance bloomed in the mountains. But the invaders had more than swords. They had smallpox, unfamiliar to the Inca, which swept through towns like invisible fire, claiming more lives than any weapon. Temples were torn down, Sunday altars smashed. Churches rose in their place like tombstones. The Quechua language was forced into hiding, spoken only in hushed tones by farmers and children in remote valleys. Even the great citadel of Machu Picchu vanished into the mist, unknown to the outside world for centuries, like a wound too deep to touch. Yet the mountains remember, the trails remain, and the people, though silenced, though broken, endured. The gold is gone. But the stories survived, in whispered songs and weavings, in footsteps tracing the stone-paved roads of ancestors who once ruled the heavens. And so the Inca did not vanish. They were buried alive in the pages of a history not written by them, but they are still breathing. If you listen closely, their heartbeats echo through the Andes, steady as stone, ancient as the sun they once worshipped. Entire generations lost not to fire or plague, but to bureaucracy, paperwork, silence. Priests and nuns with crosses around their necks preaching compassion while wielding sticks. Governments funding cultural extermination while claiming to protect. And the worst part? It worked. For decades, indigenous cultures were forced underground. Languages vanished. Rituals faded. Children grew into adults who could no longer teach their own traditions, not because they chose not to, but because they had been taught to be ashamed of them. The drum was replaced with the church bell. The story circle replaced with the classroom. But the cost was not just cultural, it was spiritual, it was psychological. A genocide not of bodies, but of identities. And still, many survived. And still, they rise. Today, survivors speak. They hold gatherings. They rebuild languages once silenced. They dig up the past, not to dwell in it, but to expose what the world tried to bury. Every unmarked grave discovered behind a school is not just a tragedy. It is a monument to endurance. For you cannot kill a people by killing their memory not forever. The earth remembers. The rivers remember. And the children, now elders, speak again. They speak not for revenge, but for truth. Not with hate, but with pain carved into resilience. Because history did not end with swords. It continued in classrooms, courtrooms, and correctional facilities. And if we truly wish to understand the brutality of humanity, we must stop looking only at the past and begin listening to the silence we were trained to ignore. Now picture a long road carved not by wheels or maps, but by footsteps soaked in sorrow. It stretches across hills, rivers, and forests, and though it is invisible to most, its weight still presses against the soul of a nation. This was not a battlefield, but it holds the dead just the same. This was not war, but it was a massacre. Not with bullets, but with hunger, exhaustion, and despair. It is the winter of 1838. The air is bitter, but colder still is the silence forced upon thousands of people as they are driven from the land of their ancestors. These are the Cherokee, the Muskogee, the Seminole, the Choctaw, and the Chickasaw tribes that once thrived in the southeast woodlands of what is now the United States. They had signed treaties, they had adapted, they built schools, printed newspapers, wore European clothing. Some had adopted Christianity, but none of it mattered. The government had decided that they were in the way. Gold had been discovered. Settlers wanted land. And so the solution was not negotiation, it was removal. Under the Indian Removal Act, thousands were forced from their homes and marched west to what was called Indian Territory. But there was no honor in this migration, no dignity in the forced journey. This was not relocation, it was exile. Men, women, children, entire families were herded at gunpoint. Many had no shoes, no blankets, only what they could carry. There were no wagons for most, no mercy for the old or the sick. They walked for miles each day, across frozen ground and muddy rivers. watched always by soldiers who showed more discipline to their rifles than to their hearts. Disease spread quickly. Cholera, dysentery, pneumonia. Graves were shallow and frequent. Mothers gave birth in snow. Fathers buried their children with their bare hands. Elders who had once told stories around fires now died in silence, their wisdom left to drift away with their final breath. It is said that more than 4,000 Cherokee alone died along the Trail of Tears. And yet numbers cannot tell the whole story. What was truly lost was deeper, a sense of place, of belonging, of rootedness in the earth itself. They had not just been removed from land. They had been ripped from memory, from sacred sites, from generations of burial grounds and blessings. And when they arrived at their destination, nothing waited for them. No homes, no welcome, no relief. Just more struggle, more grief, and the ache of trying to remember who they had been before the march had stolen so much of what they loved. But the true horror was that this was not an isolated act. It was a pattern. Over and over, native peoples were forced west, further and further, until the map had no room left for them, except in the margins, in places called reservations, which were not gifts, but cages. Still, they endured, they rebuilt, again and again, from the dust of broken treaties and the ruins of their sacred places. They taught their children not only how to survive, but how to remember, how to speak the words once outlawed, how to dance in ways once punished, how to exist not as relics, but as living nations. And today, if you listen, really listen, you will hear the echo of footsteps still marching, not in grief, but in defiance, not toward exile, but toward reclamation. For the Trail of Tears did not end at the edge of Indian territory. It continues in courtrooms where land is fought for, in schools where language is revived, in hearts that carry stories the world tried to erase. The journey is not over. But now, they walk not in chains. They walk with memory and fire. The open plains once stretched unbroken to the horizon seas of grass, where the sky seemed closer to the earth, and the wind carried the voices of 1,000 generations. Here, the buffalo roamed in herds so vast they could darken the land for hours as they passed. And alongside them lived the people of the plains, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Comanche, and many others. Their lives were not built on conquest, but on movement, on respect, on a sacred bond with the earth and the beasts that sustained them. To kill a buffalo was a prayer. Every part was used: meat, hide, bone, sinew, nothing wasted. Their stories were painted on hides, sung in ceremonies, told by the fire. The buffalo were not just food, they were life. They were ancestors. And so, to destroy these people, the invaders did not need more armies. They needed to destroy the buffalo. What followed was not war in the traditional sense. It was something colder, calculated. Official policy. US generals and politicians knew they couldn't win by force alone, so they turned to starvation. Kill the buffalo, and the people will break. And so began a slaughter beyond comprehension. From the 1860s through the 1880s, hunters, many funded and encouraged by the government, killed millions of bison, not for food, not for survival, but for profit and for policy. Carcasses were left to rot in the sun. Trains stopped in the plains just so passengers could fire rifles into herds for sport. By the time the bloodlust had quieted, the great herds were gone. A species nearly erased, an ecosystem crippled. And with them, the independence of the plains tribes was shattered. What followed was the age of broken promises. The treaties signed with the United States, documents filled with hollow words of peace, protection, and sovereignty, were betrayed one after another. Land guaranteed, forever, was taken within a generation. Reservations were drawn up, often on the worst, driest, least fertile land. Resources were cut, supplies delayed, food spoiled or never arrived. The people were no longer free, they were penned, like animals, on plots meant not to preserve, but to pacify. Missionaries arrived to save their souls. Agents arrived to count their rations. Soldiers arrived when they resisted. And yet the people endured. When Sitting Bull danced, he danced for a vision of freedom. When Crazy Horse rode, he rode not for blood, but for the memory of a land unbroken. But their resistance was not seen as noble. It was marked as savagery, and the full force of a growing empire bore down on them. Wounded Knee, 1,890. The snow was fresh. The soldiers were nervous. A ghost dance had terrified Washington, a spiritual movement, a prayer that the old world would return, that the buffalo would rise, and the white man would vanish. The people gathered, mostly elders, women, and children. The soldiers moved in with Hotchkiss guns. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. More than 250 Lakota were killed, shot as they fled, shot as they begged, shot as they tried to shield their children, bodies frozen in the snow. And when it was over, the survivors were marched to Pine Ridge, shivering, starving, their prayers silenced by smoke. Medals were handed out to the soldiers. History called it a last conflict. But it was not the end. It was only a new beginning, one that would take the war from the land and into the soul, from rifles to classrooms, from massacres to memory. And even in that deepest winter, something remained, something that no bullet, no treaty, no betrayal could kill. A spark, a whisper, a promise that the story was not over. The rifles had fallen silent, the cavalry had disbanded, the blood-stained snows of Wounded Knee had melted into the past. But the war, the real war, was not over. It had only changed its weapons. Now it came wearing the mask of civilization. In the 20th century, America declared that the so-called Indian problem could be solved not through bullets, but through assimilation. The goal was simple, chilling, and clear: to erase the native from the native. Laws were passed. Policies drafted in marble halls by men who had never set foot on a reservation. They spoke of uplift, progress, modernization. But every word was soaked in arrogance. Every decision rooted in the belief that indigenous identity was something to be corrected. The boarding schools multiplied. Children were taken again, not with muskets now, but with legal orders. Their parents were threatened with prison. Their communities were powerless to resist. The children were loaded onto trains, separated from their families, their tribes, their homelands. And when they arrived, they were stripped of everything: clothes, language, names, ceremony. Even siblings were separated. Their hair was cut often brutally. Their mouths were washed with soap when they spoke their mother tongue. They were taught that their ancestors were primitive, that their gods were false, that their skin was shame. If they cried, they were punished. If they resisted, they were beaten. If they survived, they returned home as strangers, unable to speak to their own grandparents, unable to participate in the traditions that once defined them. But assimilation didn't stop at the classroom door. Native spiritual practices were outlawed. Sacred dances, sweat lodges, ceremonies all criminalized. Priests and government agents patrolled the reservations, confiscating drums, burning regalia, arresting elders who dared to pass down their stories. The Dawes Act carved tribal land into individual plots, breaking communal ties and selling off what remained to settlers. The Indian Reorganization Act reversed some damage, only to be replaced by the termination policy in the 1950s, an initiative that aimed to dissolve tribal governments entirely, cut federal ties, and scatter native people into urban centers under the illusion of freedom. Families were torn apart again, this time by adoption programs. Thousands of native children were placed with white families, their cultural ties severed in the name of love, love that refused to see the roots it had ripped. And yet, even as policies stacked like stones on a grave, something refused to die. In secret, elders whispered the language to those who would listen. In hidden rooms, ceremonies were held by candlelight. Songs were hummed quietly, memorized, and passed along like heirlooms of survival. And when the time was right, when the fires of resistance began to glow again, the people rose. They marched. They occupied. They took to courtrooms, to rivers, to the steps of Congress. The American Indian movement was born in the 1960s, not from nostalgia, but from pain and purpose. From a desire not just to survive, but to be heard, to be whole again. And slowly, the silence began to break. Languages once forbidden are now taught again. Ceremonies once criminalized are now protected. Children who were once told to forget are now learning to remember. But healing is not swift. How do you repair something that was designed to be broken? How do you reclaim identity when your great-grandmother's tongue was stolen? How do you rebuild a culture when your churches sit atop burial grounds, your schools atop orphanages, your laws atop lies? There is no easy answer, only the long, hard walk back. But they are walking, not in chains, not in silence, but with drums, with pride, with memory as their weapon. Because culture is not a costume, it is not a trend. It is breath, passed from one generation to the next, and that breath, though once strangled, still lives. The bullets may be rubber now, but they still bruise the skin. The soldiers wear different uniforms, but their orders echo the same logic. The land, once stolen by rifle and signature, is still being claimed now by pipeline, corporation, and court ruling. But the resistance has changed too. It has grown louder, smarter, unafraid. The battle for survival has entered a new era. It is 2016. The wind whips across the North Dakota plains. Snow has begun to fall, light at first, then thick and punishing. But still they stand, thousands of them. Elders, youth, veterans, tribes from across the continent. Some came in old trucks, some came on horseback, some walked. They call themselves water protectors, not protesters. Because they are not here to make noise. They are here to defend something sacred. The Missouri River lifeblood to millions is threatened. A black snake, they say, is being forced into the earth. The Dakota Access Pipeline, approved without consultation, routed through ancestral burial grounds, built with no regard for the treaties that promised this land to the Sioux forever. At Standing Rock, a camp forms, a village born not of politics, but of prayer. Teepees rise, sacred fires are lit, songs are sung beneath helicopters. Drums beat as prayers echo across the cold earth. And for a moment, it feels like something ancient has returned. Not the past, but the memory of who they were before the world was stolen. But the empire has not changed. Not really. The state arrives with riot gear and armored trucks. Dogs are unleashed on unarmed women. Rubber bullets strike children. Water cannons fire in sub-zero temperatures. The images go viral. The silence breaks. People watch not just from nearby towns, but from around the globe. For the first time in decades, the stories of native resistance are front and center. And they are not stories of defeat. They are stories of power. Because this fight is not just about a pipeline. It is about sovereignty. About the right to say no. About the right to protect what was promised in ink and blood, and what was never truly returned. It is about survival, yes, but also about dignity. About standing in the face of bulldozers and saying, "We are still here." And though the pipeline was completed, something else was built that winter, something no court could dissolve. Unity. Young people who had never heard their language began to learn it. Elders who once whispered their traditions now taught them openly. Tribes who had once been divided found common cause. The fight continued in the courtroom, on the land, in the classrooms, and in every place where identity had once been silenced. Across the continent, other battles rise. In the forests of British Columbia, Wet'suwet, on-land defenders block oil infrastructure. In Hawaii, native Hawaiians protect Mauna Kea, a sacred mountain threatened by development. In the Amazon, indigenous protectors face down logging and fire. The front lines have grown, and so has the fire in the hearts of those who fight. This is not ancient history. This is now. And the scars of the past still shape the battles of the present. The trauma of boarding schools echoes in broken families. The legacy of forced removal lives in overcrowded reservations. The systems built to erase native people still exist. They've just changed form. But so has the resistance. It is in the songs sung at blockades, in the court victories reclaimed after generations of struggle, in the land acknowledgements now heard at universities, in the children learning their grandmother's words. In the art, the literature, the defiant joy of surviving when you were never meant to. This is not the story of a vanished people. This is the story of a people who refused to vanish. Now the drums are quiet. The fire has burned low. The names we've spoken: Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, those who walked the Trail of Tears, those who stood at Standing Rock, drift like embers into the dark. But their stories remain, glowing faintly in the silence, waiting for someone to remember. Because history does not sleep, it lingers. It lingers in the treaties still ignored, gathering dust in national archives. It lingers in the poisoned water on reservations, in the schools still failing native children, in the land still being sold as though it holds no memory. It lingers in museums, where sacred items are locked behind glass, labeled artifacts instead of ancestors. It lingers in the suburbs and cities built on bones and broken promises, in streets named after the very men who signed death warrants disguised as law. And it lingers in us. You, listening now wherever you are not outside this story. None of us are. We are heirs to it, beneficiaries or survivors, depending on the blood in our veins and the history we've been taught to forget. But forgetting is a choice, and so is remembering. To remember means to confront, to look directly at the things we were not taught in school, to say the names of lost nations: Lenape, Osage, Yuchi, Abenaki, Salish, Duwamish, not as ghosts, but as nations that still exist, still breathe, still fight. To remember means to ask, what was taken to build the world we live in, and what is owed? Because this isn't just a native story, it's a human one. A story about power and erasure, about what happens when greed outweighs empathy, about the cost of empire, not in maps, but in mothers and daughters and fathers and songs. It is a story of how people tried to silence the earth, and how the earth spoke back through those who never stopped listening. And now, in this moment, that story reaches you. Maybe you're sitting in a warm room. Maybe the sky is turning dark outside your window. Maybe you're on land once wall. Maybe you're sitting in a warm room. Maybe the sky is turning dark outside your window. Maybe you're on land once walked by those who no longer have a voice to speak for themselves. Or maybe you're of them. Maybe your ancestors were forced to march, forced to forget, forced to survive. Either way, you are part of the echo. So the question is not whether the past matters. The question is, what will you do with it? Will you let the silence grow deeper? Or will you speak the truth, even when it's uncomfortable? Will you look away? Or will you look closer at the history beneath your feet, at the stories buried under concrete and comfort? The story is not over, because as long as there is breath in those who remember those who sing in Lakota and Dine and Cherokee, those who stand between oil rigs and sacred ground, those who dance where their ancestors once bled, then this history still lives. Not in books, but in bones, in blood, in the beating heart of resistance. And in the end, perhaps that's the most terrifying and beautiful truth of all. You cannot kill a people who refuse to forget. If this story moved you, if it stirred something deep and true, then I invite you to stay with us. There are more forgotten truths to uncover, more shadows to walk through. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a step on this path through the buried past. Until next time, thank you for listening. And remember, history is not gone. It is simply waiting for someone to see it.